And these are the things we're asking about how deeply rooted are they and how open to change. First of all, active citizenship. If you get this package here, you're going to have of 11 different components that I'm going to show you. You're likely to have a very rich, very liberal, and very robust democratic culture. So one is active citizenship, a disposition to obviously participate not just in elections, but in exercising political voice. The second is informed citizenship, that the citizen has a knowledge of the political system, and we would hope with some basis of rationality as well, in terms of logical and empirically based positions on the issues and evaluations of the system. The third is efficacy. Anybody heard of this word before? Okay. So here is a distinction we need to make between two words and at two levels. When we use efficacy at the system level as opposed to effectiveness, we're not talking about outcomes per se, we're talking about capacity, okay? Is the system capable of being effective? Is it capable of arriving at solutions to the problems of the country? And we have a question about that in our survey data. Is democracy capable of solving the problems of this country? When we talk about it personally, we're talking about whether people feel that they themselves, through their own participation, through their own political behavior, can have some kind of impact. If you feel that, you know, your country's politics is really hopelessly under the control of a bunch of plutocrats or oligarchs or hidden special interests, and nothing you do can make a difference, why would you participate? And why would you feel a strong commitment to the system either? So efficacy is the belief that if you do participate, you can ultimately, or at least some of the time, have a positive impact. Now, if that's all you've got is efficacious, maybe informed, but also passionate and intense participation, you may have a lot of intense activity, but also conflict and confrontation. And so we need some mechanisms to get people to be able to live with one another and to be able to coexist with active citizen participants that they are in competition with over policies and maybe parties and candidates. And this is where the next set of several crucially important elements of democratic culture come in. Tolerance of opposing points of view and parties, and as well tolerance of all kinds of minorities, of any identity that one might imagine, so that you have a society of dignity in which everybody's on an equal plane, no matter who they are, and you know, where they come from, what their linguistic history is, what their skin color is, what they believe, how they live their lives. All of this shouldn't matter in terms of equality of citizenship. Moderation in terms of lack of ideological extremism. Now, I will say here, I think it's important to say here, that moderation in terms of like everybody having kind of, you know, very only slightly left point of view or slightly right point of view is, first of all, it's not democratic to say that everybody's got to be basically, you know, some only slight variation on a theme in terms of political ideology. In a democracy, people have to have the right to hold, I would say, even radical points of view. If most people in politics, however, hold views that are to, you know, the ideologically extreme ends of the spectrum, It just stands to logical reason. It's going to be hard to get things done. And in any case, whatever people's views, it will be easier for government to function. And for political conflict over policies and political conflict over parties and campaigns, to be managed within boundaries of fidelity to the law and to principles of nonviolence and the rule of law, if people have some degree of pragmatism and flexibility, and the logical result of that, a willingness to compromise. And this thing is actually the most important of all, because if people understand that if they can't mobilize a majority for however potent, sharp, and maybe even radical their agenda is, and they're willing to bargain and compromise to get what they want, then democracy can work, even if people have, fairly sharply defined, or what they would view as maybe visionary and ahead of their times, substantive programs. If their view is, these are my forceful views, and it's my way or the highway, and I will say this without any reflection on our current national tragedy, but just as a general observation, I will shut down the government if I don't get my way. Well, think of what that's going to do to governability in a democracy if people are unwilling to compromise and not only have sharply defined views, but take maximalist positions. It's very hard to maintain tolerance in that context. It's very hard to govern in that context. And then, if you've got that kind of attitude, it tends to eventually drive toward very demeaning, sharply opposing views of the other side that lead to political polarization, political enmity, and difficulty in sustaining democracy. So this is why civility of discourse is so important, that you may sharply disagree, but if you don't call your opponents monsters and don't treat them as monsters and accord them some elementary dignity and respect, it's much easier to compromise with them. Democracy is built on mutual trust, mutual respect, mutual tolerance, and if you have all that, it's easier to get everyone to believe in the legitimacy of democracy, to eschew any thought or contemplation of an action that might violate democratic or constitutional norms, such as preventing people from voting, rigging an election, doing something that would be grotesquely unfair, illegal, or unconstitutional. Finally, we get to this complicated issue of what's the right attitude toward authority in a liberal democracy. And the issue here is, again, balance, and you'll see it in a minute with the whole concept of the civic culture. Balance in this sense. If you don't have some sense of a willingness to acknowledge and respect the legitimate, law-based, constitutional authority of an elected democratic system, how can a democratic government govern? What you've got is just maximalist mobilization in the streets, no ability to really aggregate it into policy, dysfunction, paralysis, and I will tell you from much reading of the historical record, eventually a slide toward democratic breakdown. On the other hand, if what you have is fawning, uncritical, kind of charismatic deference to a leader without thinking about what the leader is doing or asking of the citizens, and without holding that leader to some kind of standards of lawfulness and accountability, well, that's obviously very dangerous as well. Then you've got the populist connection, we'll talk about it more, between an illiberal demagogue and a large-scale mass following that he or she, but it's usually a he, is trying to mobilize ultimately against democracy itself. So this leads to this famous quote from the late political philosopher who ended his years on the Stanford campus at the Hoover Institution, Sidney Hook, which I think is a very important statement and very, very relevant to our times. A positive requirement of a working democracy is, look how carefully, by the way, if you're just kind of trying to think about writing, look at how carefully he has chosen each word here. An intelligent distrust of its leadership. A skepticism stubborn but not blind of all demands for the enlargement of power, and an emphasis upon the critical method in every phase of social life. So I would recommend you go back, unpack this, think about this.